Hello, and welcome to our session at the Ethics and Compliance Congress sponsored by PCF. HIMA, Malini, and myself will be discussing how organizations could try to strive for next generation compliance risk management by using advanced analytics. Now, through sharing a case study from BMS, our goal is to share practical lessons from a journey to strengthen compliance monitoring using advanced analytics. So let's start off with some introductions. Malini?
Hi, I'm Malini Natarajan, and I sit within the Compliance and Ethics Organization in BMS, leading a global center of expertise that's focused on monitoring and analytics and third-party due diligence. What that means is we're really focused on technology-driven capabilities to manage and monitor our healthcare compliance and anti-bribery risks. So a few examples of the capabilities we've built. We have a global standard compliance risk assessment and management process. And the other capability we'll spend quite a bit of time today is we have global standard outliers and anomaly detection as it relates to our interactions with healthcare professionals, which kind of gives us that continuous monitoring capability. This year, we've also started some email monitoring with a pilot using machine learning that we're looking to scale up. So truly exciting, sitting at the intersection of compliance, analytics, and a lot of innovation that we're trying to bring to this area. The second aspect of my role is completing due diligences of our higher risk third parties around the globe. So in our world, that looks like contract research organizations, vendors providing market access services, interacting with government officials and things like that. So really very happy to be here and part of this panel and really hope that you have some good takeaways as I've had at similar panels, and a big thanks to PCF for making this happen. With that, I'll turn it over to my partner in realizing this compliance vision at Analytics, HIMA.
Thank you, Malini. Hello, everyone. My name is HIMA Pavaluri, and I'm currently a Senior Director at Bristol Myers Squibb within our Business Insights and Analytics division, where I get to lead the Enterprise Risk Analytics team. My team's remit is to provide data and analytics support to various functions such as compliance and ethics monitoring, global internal audit, enterprise risk management, business controls function, and legal teams. We deliver value by generating business insights, analyzing trends, identifying root causes, and providing very actionable recommendations to our stakeholders. What excites me is the manner in which risk monitoring space is continuously evolving to become more cross-functional in nature, and the role of analytics to drive risk monitoring within and across these functions to gain awareness of our risk coverage and surface emerging trends is just absolutely fantastic. So thank you everyone for tuning into this presentation and allowing us to share our case study today.
Yeah, thanks, Hima and Malini. And I'm Michael Shaw. I head up the Global Risk and Compliance practice at ZS Associates, where our ambition is to unlock a new level of innovation, performance, and patient outcomes by better navigating risk. I have about 26 years in healthcare and life sciences as a senior compliance professional. The last 10 plus were at GSK as a chief compliance officer role for our North America business, as well as global franchises, as well as including a role heading up our global monitoring program where we transformed our monitoring program using advanced analytics. Earlier in my career, spent some time in senior compliance leadership roles at Novartis, as well as being a senior counsel at the Office of Inspector General, where I developed multiple compliance program guidance documents for the industry. So with the intros, now let's get into a few points as to what this presentation is going to be about and what it's not. So first, we intend to share lessons from developing advanced analytics to advance risk management and compliance business partnering. What this presentation will not do is to suggest that the best advanced analytics in the world will eliminate every scintilla of risk. That's just not going to happen. But it will make for a good part of an ethics and compliance program, an effective ethics and compliance program, as well as foster business partnering, as well as foster a good ethical culture. Now, the views in this presentation represent each of our personal views and do not represent the formal positions from our respective companies. So let's start off with a metaphor before we get into this really exciting case study that we're looking forward to sharing with you all. So a decade or so ago, if someone was feeling not that great, sluggish each day, maybe not getting good sleep, unduly stressed, or maybe when you work out, the individual was feeling heart palpitations. What were the choices there? Well, generally speaking, someone might see a healthcare professional to get diagnostic work done and figure out what underlying health risks might be going on to make the individual feel that way. And hopefully some pointers and some behaviors on how to try to improve that individual's health. So now with the innovation of biometric watches, which I'm wearing as well, we're able to have supercomputers on our wrists that tell us individual metrics when it comes to certain health measures, whether that's heart rate, blood oxygen level, breaths per minute, etc. And what that does is it enables us to see potentially individual risks related to our health. But then the cool part is when these measures are triangulated in composite scores to tell us how good our sleep was, or how stressed we got, or how much energy we have for the next day. So this is a really cool thing. And on a personal note, by the way, you know, in the last presentation that HIMA, Melanie, and myself did to prepare for this, my watch started going off and said, you know, you're having too much stress and you need to relax. It literally did that. I'm not even kidding. And I just wanted to share that with the crew because that's how excited I get about compliance analytics. But nonetheless, what these watches do is it helps us give us information to hopefully change our behaviors. So if we see we took a drink of alcohol one night and it ruined our sleep score and our energy the next day, maybe we change that negative behavior going forward. So why lead with this metaphor? Because the hope is that we could, as compliance professionals, harness similar data, but not about health risks per se, but about compliance risks associated with commercial, medical, clinical activities in our respective organizations, both at an individual level as well as a triangulated level, so we could see composite risk in more of a real-time manner, share that data with the business with the interest to change behaviors and foster an ethical and compliant culture. So now that we have that grounding in that metaphor, just a really quick background on how we got here in compliance monitoring. Originally in 1991, when the federal sentencing guidelines came out, one of the elements of an effective compliance program was articulated as monitoring. However, the core of that was to detect criminal conduct. As the years went on, we had other guidance documents, say from the OIG, where it expanded just past criminal conduct to say you also want to monitor for violations of policies and procedures. Then we went further with advancements in the federal sentencing guidelines covering culture, as well as ethics, as well as risk management, to most recently with the DOJ's guidance, where it talks about pressure testing controls to make sure that your compliance controls are still fit for purpose. But when HIMA and Melanie and myself talk about advanced monitoring, like we will today, and advanced analytics, the hope is that that advanced word is not just about technology, but helping enable compliance monitoring as a driver of change for innovation and business practices, as well as identifying emerging compliance issues before they become major risks, and also enabling the flexibility to accommodate to a changing environment. So that's our background. And with that background, I'd love it, Melanie, if you could start sharing with us the journey at BMS and how you kind of unlocked your ambition and how you went around that journey with the lessons learned along the way.
Absolutely. Michael, and I could not agree more with what you mentioned about compliance and other risk management functions really needing to be an enabler of business, because every business has to take some level of risk. So we really want to support that rather than being a burden. And any discussion about analytics and technology just demonstrate how integral all of that is to this journey. So in BMS, I think similar to a lot of organizations, over a decade ago, analytics became this buzzword of how it was really going to transform how we could manage risks within the enterprise, right? So for purposes of this discussion, we're going to call that beginning stages of our analytics journey ad hoc monitoring. And if I think back to both my audit days as well as compliance, what that looked like is us going from doing substantive testing, making sample selections, to now being able to get reports, and sometimes even applying simple filters and other analytics using tools like Excel to start to get more complete coverage over populations. We started to be able to do a little bit more sophisticated trending. And like Michael said, it doesn't have to be this significant build to start to unlock value. And these kind of ad hoc monitoring solutions, I think, continue to have a relevance as fit for purpose solutions, even as you continue through this journey. But certainly had its disadvantages, right? Because it was discrete and standalone, definitely manually intensive. And one of the things it really helped to highlight for all of us was the criticality of having that really great data to unlock the power of analytics. So at this point in the journey, it's a great time, and this is one of the takeaways that I'll really reinforce, is it's a great opportunity to say, for the risks that I would like to try manage through analytics, risks that lend themselves to that kind of monitoring, how can I identify the data sets that are critical and begin to influence those proactively? This means getting a seat at the table when relevant processes and systems are being designed, because you really want to influence two things. One is where you need certain data points. Those are actually part of the build, so you're capturing the data. And two, you might need to make sure that some fields are mandatory. So again, you get that consistently. And for global companies, that you get to really have this standardized across all of your markets to enable that comparison. So I think this also, for all of us, unleashed our imagination in terms of how we could begin to transform our functions and the value we deliver to business. And so that's where we'll call the next phase of the journey rules-based monitoring. But really at BMS, what our vision was to say, can we implement a standard set of global outliers that monitor all of our interactions with healthcare professionals? So we're talking speaker programs, ad boards, T&E meals. And that is the vision that we have realized over the past few years. And it's certainly been an iterative process. But now we are able to look at a vast majority of our transactions and identify such exceptions and have an automated process where we're also able to trigger notifications to an employee's manager to have them action outliers. So we kind of have that pull through to drive the business unit accountability, which is another key takeaway that I'll reinforce, because that's really critical to any risk management that you do, kind of that governance process to see how you're really taking the takeaways to change behavior. And certainly, this kind of continues to give us other benefits in terms of the visualizations and visibility and things like that. But I'm going to ask you, HIMA, if you could, as we think about our journey, even from the ad hoc to what we're calling rules-based, what are some of the critical enablers from your perspective?
Thank you, Malini. And you've actually highlighted a couple of points, right? And I couldn't agree with you more that the most critical enabler in this journey is data. It is essential that we prioritize this risk that needs to be monitored. So we want to start off with considering that the data that's more readily available to us, and then think about applying simple analytic techniques to start the journey to leverage data analytics platforms. So sometimes these can be siloed in your organization or centralized if the data sets are more mature and democratized for everybody's consumption. And then from there, you want to start thinking about how do we focus on making investments towards automation to support these existing monitoring processes, like, whether it's the visualizations, continuous monitoring, the feedback, loop. So thinking about how do we, derive process efficiencies through automation would be the next critical enabler.
Great, thank you. And so with the foundation that we have, this was a great time for us to say, what's next? And the whys for us were really compelling, both within compliance as well as with the businesses that we serve. What everybody's looking for is how can we get to some of those leading indicators of risk so that we can try intervene even earlier. Data sources are getting more robust across the organization. So how can we really start to correlate even more cross-functional data sets? And I think there's also a great opportunity to kind of get beyond some of the limitations of rules-based analytics. So that's really what set us off on the journey to next gen. And I don't know, HIMA, if there's anything else you want to add by way of critical enablers sort of in that point of the journey.
I mean, here I just want to emphasize the point of, having a very strong and strategic partnership with the business stakeholders for deploying a monitoring program, right? So it's not just about monitoring our changing business model, but how do we move our focus from simply understanding what went wrong to a more forward-looking view? So again, for us, our roadmap for the next gen analytics reflects sophisticated techniques, right? So thinking about predictive analytics and artificial intelligence to be able to flag and prevent non-compliant activity ahead of time, right? So having that, short-term and long-term vision, having that roadmap would be critical.
So that's great, guys. And now, if we could, let's get into the kind of data and the activities that we think we can monitor here. So with that, let's talk about it.
Yeah. So there's a lot of data out there, and there's definitely a lot of demand around how we can leverage all of these data sources to deliver value. And there's always a limitation of resources, right? So definitely choices to be made. So we have just a few thoughts for you to consider as you embark in wherever you are in your journey. So one of the key, I think, guiding takeaways is there could already be pockets of pretty good data analysis within your organization, right? Think commercial functions. It could be other controls functions such as internal audit, controls, finance. So leverage what they're already doing, or it can be really impactful to form coalitions. So at least when it comes to data acquisition, cleansing, staging, you have additional traction with your partners, and then you can sort of pull through what you need to do from a compliance perspective. Certainly, you want to prioritize where you can drive the biggest value and biggest risk management coverage. And I'll say that's usually a marriage of where there's risk plus where you can get pretty good data. Speaker programs is a great example of that. Certainly, technology continues to get better and better. So the opportunities and what we can leverage from that perspective is great. And finally, it really takes a village for us every day to move further along on this journey. So that's something that's important, I think, to engage those partners, stakeholders right at the beginning and take them along on the journey. For us, this certainly includes our business insights and analytics team, but several teams within IT. It includes all of those owners of systems and processes that have touch points, our business partners who we're still serving, as well as their compliance advisors.
Yeah, and Malini, you have up here call activity, but as the theme of this slide and your comments are capitalizing on existing data, as we've heard from government enforcers a lot at congresses like this, our commercial and medical folks are already looking at massive amounts of analytics related to their business that even without a heavy new algorithm related to compliance risk management, just getting feeds of some of that data could share with us important risk insights. So I think that's what you're getting at as well. See what the available sources of data are out there.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So with that, let's talk about it, if you will. You took us on a journey and talked about getting to rules-based. But let's talk about, if you will, and share insights on how critical getting to a rules-based level and milestone is towards the full-on journey to advanced analytics.
Absolutely. And it is critical because it provides that very strong foundation if you did want to advance beyond that. But even getting to this place is really great and robust from the risk management coverage that it provides as it relates to interactions with healthcare professionals in our case and for this specific case study, right? So this is a very quick illustration with completely fake data of how we've iterated to what we think is a both user-friendly as well as compelling way to share the insights that we're finding in our analysis. So very quickly, if you wanted to think about this in terms of 3 sections, the visual here, the top section is really talking about your macro level data, whether it's volume of different types of interactions or the kinds of exceptions we might be finding as it relates to those interactions. We have the ability to look at that by Salesforce territory, which could be important as a business leader to understand an action. And then we get to the specifics of certain outliers and business rules that we've decided were significant for us. And the way we've built this is you have a quick snapshot on your one landing page of all of the data that would be important to you and insights you need to take away. And then if you needed to drill down further, you could certainly do that to a transaction level detail. And the other big advantage for us has been in our latest iteration, we're standardizing this across all of our markets. So it really gives us that neat ability to be able to roll it up at regional and global levels as well. And we can roll up not just the outliers and trends themselves, but since we also have that integrated tool for manager feedback, which captures risk drivers and how risks are being remediated, we get to roll that up as well, which I think is another really powerful source of data to influence how we manage compliance risks. And I say all of this, but I'll also say calling it rules-based in some ways also sounds a little bit like a disservice because we certainly have some additional statistical analysis we're doing. We've set up some alerts when you're getting close to certain caps and things like that. So we've already started to reimagine what it's like to go beyond business rules, but really gives us a great foundation to get to even more advanced analytics and do some more cool things.
Yeah, and I think that last point was really important for the audience, Malini, to understand. When we showed the roadmap earlier, that was a particular roadmap for BMS. So when we looked at on the segment of the roadmap for rules-based monitoring, it talked about continuous automated monitoring. I would suggest, from based on what I've seen with clients, when you talk rules-based, generally speaking, someone wants to get to the point where you have a policy which establishes a rule, you want to monitor against that. How advanced it gets to continuous automated monitoring, I think there's probably a spectrum there. So we don't want to discourage people from getting to rules-based monitoring, but I would suggest, to your last point, what you guys have done in that phase is a bit rules-based monitoring plus, for whatever it's worth. But, but that said, you know, can you walk us through, both of you, through how you guys landed on the ambition for where you wanted to get to in analytics?
Yeah, happy to share, right? So if we kind of started to build this slide, actually, Michael, where we are gives us some really good insight into our healthcare professional interactions and how those risks are currently being managed. We're starting to get also some good insight into some of those risk drivers so we can start to affect them, right? Whether it's coaching, whether it's SOP changes, whatever the case might be. And it's getting us started on the journey of how can we be even more proactive about monitoring compliance. But with all of that said, we also see the promise as I alluded to earlier, of how do we start to unearth risk that's not as obvious today because we're looking at transactions one risk dimension at a time. We're sort of limited to those transactions where we have a great deal of really good data. And so this is where we partnered with both HIMA as well as your team at ZS to say, how do we get to that promised land of where we could get to those even higher level goals to deliver value out of our analytics program. And I think, HIMA, you have some great insights into why the journey we took with our pilot was a great fit to be able to address those asks.
Absolutely, Malini. From based on what we have seen so far, and you'll also see through the next phase of the presentation, that the machine learning techniques do hold the promise to help us in this journey to get to that future state. One, our machine learning models can and in fact should be continuously trained to adapt to different situations and allow us to maintain visibility into all the changes that are happening from a risk perspective. Second, machine learning, through machine learning, we are starting to see meaningful insights about what are the risk drivers, by identifying those hidden themes that are over and beyond our standard policy valuations. And finally, with risk analytics advanced analytics techniques, our vision is to initiate a more proactive approach towards monitoring compliance, right? So it allows us to address more complex decisions by understanding not only what happened in the past, but why it happened, and ideally figure out how similar events can be prevented in the future. So that's really our future state ambition.
Yeah, and as you say that, HIMA, future state, just as a caveat, which I think you guys want to impress upon the audience, a lot of these ambitions have not been fully realized yet. You have the foundation. I believe it's very exciting, and you guys are on that journey. But as with most companies, it is a journey to kind of continue to unlock insights, learn from those insights, continue to advance it so that value prop for compliance and the business just gets stronger and stronger.
Yes, thank you for emphasizing that, Michael, because absolutely, we are working on this and we're very excited, but we are not there yet.
Yeah, and I emphasize it with all the right good intent, because I know Malini and HIMA are so proud of what they've developed, but they also don't want to give the wrong impression to say, hey, we at BMS, we've conquered it all. This is everything we've done. So I've had to encourage them to be more bullish in this regard, but I do want to make the caveat on their behalf. So with that, do we want to talk about pilots and how critical pilots could be towards this journey?
Yes, Michael. So again, shifting gears into the project implementation details, we have been influenced by design thinking principles, and we loosely categorized our project implementation into 4 stages. We begin with ideation, where we saw an opportunity and asked ourselves, how do we address it? Formulating the business problem happens at this stage. Then we move into experimentation. How do we build something to address this business problem? Designing and building of our machine learning models to address that business problem happens at this step. The third, and in my mind, the most important step would be around prototyping and piloting. How do we test it? This is where we need to validate and build trust for the outcomes of the model and prove the real world applicability. We also start thinking about approach to scale the solution to all markets consistently. And the final step would be scaling and operationalizing. How do we deploy and build a framework for continuous evolution? This is not just technology, but it also involves changing ways of working, right? So how do we embed these solutions into existing business processes across all markets? Honestly, scaling, I think, is a difficult task, because even though models work in small environments, it doesn't imply that they automatically will work everywhere without adjustment. So you want to think about, having that definition or approach to scaling throughout. It's not something that you would just tackle at the last step. Again, I can't stress enough that each step is very iterative in nature, and it's critical to incorporate learnings from previous iteration into the next. So at BMS.
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry, HIMA.
No, at BMS, we are in the pilot phase, as Michael mentioned, right? We're in the pilot phase of the journey where the results are looking quite promising so far. So we've completed a couple of runs of iterations of the pilot runs. And we think of a continuous improvement, how do we incorporate lessons from each iteration, each cycle into the next one.
Yeah, and I'm sorry I interrupted a moment ago. I was just going to tack on to your comment about learnings, because the learnings here from pilots are, there are so many different learnings, right? There's how you manage your data, how clean the data is, how connected the data, to your point, on a global scale, whether you could get certain data in certain markets but not other markets. But then it gets to development of key risk indicators, right? Like the more you pilot, the more you learn about the benefits, what is relevant, what is irrelevant. So like the just benefits from piloting. And the final one I would tell you, which we've seen with a lot of clients who want to start and dip a toe in the water, if you will, is it provides the business case to the business by saying, hey, look at all this cool information. We're telling you something you don't already know about either risk or your business. And then the business ends up saying, yeah, we want more. Can you look at this dimension? Can you look at this feature? So I just wanted to tack on to the benefit piece of pilots. It seems to be a pretty common industry practice right now.
Yeah, and double clicking a little bit more, right? If you think about machine learning algorithms, there are tens of thousands of algorithms out there, hundreds being developed each year. So which means there are a lot of choices and approaches from a technology and implementation perspective. For simplicity of discussion today, I'd like to illustrate the end-to-end process as three components. So you think about it at a high level as, there's an input, there's a process, and output. So the first step of the process is what we refer to as feature engineering, which is basically the process of preparing the proper input data set that's compatible with the machine learning algorithm requirements. The second step is what we refer to as the anomaly detection, right? So this is a process of identifying those rare events or observations which can raise suspicions, right? Because these are statistically different from the rest of our transactions. Our idea is that these anomalous transactions typically translate to some kind of problem or compliance risk. And finally, the third piece is the outputs. And how do we interpret, the outputs? This is a step where we translate what's being generated from the machine learning models into meaningful risk insights and integrate these outcomes into existing compliance monitoring processes. So really it involves a very high level of collaboration and continuous learning. I want to highlight that it is different from traditional project implementations where tech teams come in, solicit business requirements from stakeholders, go off, build something, and come back with a finished product. It is different. You want to bring, your stakeholders and subject matter experts along in the journey. So collaboration, I couldn't stress enough for these kind of implementations.
Yeah, that's great. Great insights, HIMA. And HIMA, so we're dealing with a lot of data, a lot of systems. Can you walk us through with how you dispense between what's really valuable and insightful data and what might be irrelevant, like the prioritization process that you go through?
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to start off by saying that the features or the data attributes that we use, for the models, it has the highest influence on the result. So no algorithm alone, to my knowledge, can supplement the information gain given by correct feature engineering. So we do want to spend time, and it is very typical to spend a disproportionate amount of time on this phase. So when compared to, the other phases in the implementation. So At a high level, generally speaking, you're starting off with identifying the features that will be most useful. For us, a starting point was, leveraging, what are your key risk indicators and data attributes that are already part of your role-based monitoring process, right? So that's a good start. You want to think about, do we need to apply any transformations or any additional manipulations that could improve your model performance? You want to think about data extraction. Where can I find the data? For us, most of the data was available within the department, but there were additional data sets that we had to source from other teams. And finally, the most important aspect, Michael, to your question, is the feature selection process. This is where, once you have that baseline, you want to analyze or determine which features are irrelevant and which are most useful. Again, this is a very important but very iterative step that involves leveraging our domain knowledge to select and transform the most relevant variables from the data sources that we've identified before. We need to ensure that our subject matter experts and there's are part of the journey, right? So you have good representation from your 360 view, to advise and validate that we are truly getting this step correctly. This is not the step where the data scientists can go off and build on their own. Partnership is required. Just to give you an example of a pilot at BMS, when we thought about if you just think about the model for events data, as part of our pilot, we started off with identifying roughly 160 different data features, and we go through this iterative refinement process to get down to roughly 40 features at this point that we think are most relevant. So it goes that funneling process. And again, similarly, for your models, for your TNE data and other data sets, you do go through that continuous refinement process. So when implemented correctly, we can expect it to achieve valuable outcomes from the machine learning models. You can start to understand what are your key features driving risk. You get access to granular risk scores that the model generates, and I'll get into that a little bit in the next couple of slides. We get to derive summaries and trends based on these various risk categories, and begin to understand, is there a correlation between metrics and observed risk, right? Again, these are just a few flavors of what you could do with the outcomes in the model, but the future looks quite promising from the experiment so far.
Yeah, and I would say, HIMA, this is a really big rate limiter in the industry right now, because a number of companies that do have solid, formidable compliance monitoring programs still find this whole trial and error effort to kind of figure out what works, what doesn't. It's daunting at times, and it takes energy. But the hope would be that companies realize you don't have to solve for everything overnight. It does become that iterative process. It does become that piloting phase. And I think the government would reasonably expect companies to try, but part of someone's compliance monitoring program doesn't mean, hey, we have to get from A to Z by a year. It means let's take a look at what is possible, right? So I would think that resonates.
Absolutely.
Yep. So with that, do you want to? Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Malini.
Oh, I was just going to interject very quickly to say analytics is not a linear journey by any stretch. And I think you sort of have to get comfortable with making mistakes, learning, iterating, and moving forward.
Yes. And now I thank you for that, Malini. Now I think HIMA's going to walk through for some of us heavy data scientists, non-analytics experts, simplify for us the whole approach to machine learning. So with that, HIMA.
Yes, and Michael, for the techies in the audience, right, who are interested in understanding what was the choice of the machine learning algorithm we used at BMS, it is basically an unsupervised anomaly detection algorithm known as isolation forest. So the objective of this process is really to find that small percentage of data that is truly anomalous or statistically different from what we consider as a normal universe. in the illustration that you're seeing here, it's really all the apples that are not red or normal sized are isolated first. The next step is where the model assigns a risk score to each individual transaction and how different the transaction is from the normal universe. The risk score here is a direct reflection of the anomalous behavior. And the underlying premise is that we assume a transaction is considered to be of a higher risk when it contains more risk attributes, like 3 risk attributes versus 1 or 2. So in real world, for our pilot, these anomalies were actually identified based on more than 40 features that I made a reference to in the previous slide, right? That was selected part of the feature engineering step. And I wanted to pause and just call out that this is really the main difference between a statistic expert rule-based monitoring process and machine learning techniques, right? It's not just single dimensional, but it's the process of identifying the anomalies based on multiple dimensions. So similar to how any compliance analytics program is more effective when we continuously use and monitor, we need to make sure we plan for our models to be trained periodically to learn and adjust to changing risk landscape. And even within our pilots, right, just making configuration changes, we continue to learn and refine to suit what best represents BMS's compliance landscape and what we want to measure.
Great. So let's get to the outputs. Let's take a look at what this thing generates.
Yeah, and this is just really a very simplified illustration of the risk scoring framework we have implemented at BMS. And again, I want to call out that this is only one example, and you can actually customize it to your organization requirements. There's so many different ways to set up the scoring framework based on your needs. So the idea here is we start at that most granular, risk score that is assigned to each transaction by our models, and then start aggregating to higher level entity scores. So if you build the slide, Mike, you can start aggregating the score at a third-party level or a market level based on all the data sources you have configured to your models. Again, other choices, you could do it by therapeutic area, product, or teams, right? So you have other choices based on your needs. So we, at this stage, as I said, we begin to see the raw scores, and each transaction score is a result of analysis of all the features that have been configured. We start to see insights on what are the top features that contribute towards the anomalous behaviors, which ones overlap existing monitoring scenarios, and what are the additional themes that are emerging that are typically not detected as standard policy violations. If you continue to build a slide, Michael, for example, you see we found that the product indication launch timing is an important feature to detect outlier behavior, something that's not necessarily tracked in isolation, right? Similarly, average speaker to HCP attendee ratio for events organized by the rep team, or average number of meals for the same meal type HCP received from the same teams. So again, these are some examples, right? And you can start, again, the outcomes are very different for each market, right? So for market A, your top features could be very different from market B. So you can get very customized insights without having to hard code business rules. The machine learning algorithms learns from the data to derive those underlying hidden themes. So what we're seeing is that introducing scenarios that are completely new or modified that are typically not part of a standard monitoring can give us meaningful insights when analyzed through these machine learning techniques. And if you can go to the next slide, Michael. So the next step here, again, is a very simple illustration of, we start to begin to aggregate these individual scores into a higher level. Here you're seeing how the individual scores for 4 transactions associated to an HCP is rolled up to an overall score for the HCP, assuming this is the full universe of transactions for that HCP. But we decided to move away from these scores and further encapsulate them into different risk segments, which is slightly more intuitive and actionable. And Michael, if you can progress to the next slide. This is again a very simple illustration of how we set up segmentation using, let's say transaction volume and percentage of transactions that are risky for a given universe. It could be a geography, a therapeutic area, a product, or a sales team. Again, there's so many different ways you could do this. And you have additional options. You could bring in materiality of the transaction into the mix to further, refine how you want to segment. So really, this approach allows our compliance teams to prioritize review of business activities, starting with, where do I focus first? What is my highest risk segment?
Yeah, and on that last point, HIMA, it doesn't, as much as part of this is an exact science, data science, what you just described on where you establish those levels and where you go red to orange, et cetera, that is not an exact science, but that's okay because, as you said, it doesn't matter if it helps prioritize for the compliance team or others, or even ultimately the business, it prioritizes where the focus should be on certain activities with the hope of prevention as well going forward too. So I would imagine like you guys don't beat yourselves up about where that level is between red and orange, but over time it may change, right?
Yes, and it's important for the consumer, right? So for them to have that drill down capability to understand, like this is almost like a top-down view. This is where you begin, but to understand the underlying drivers and the supporting transaction to be able to navigate by themselves.
Yeah, great.
Again, here just one more illustration of the types of insights that you could start seeing from the model, right? These metrics again have been masked for today's discussion, but if you click through the slide, Michael, we started with seeing a high percentage of overlap between the model results and our rule-based monitoring, which allowed us to validate our outcomes. We started to identify additional risk drivers based on the observation of the data, which can be incorporated into our monitoring process. And that presents an opportunity to investigate additional data that demonstrates some kind of outlier behavior that the rule-based practices would have missed, right? So these are your signals and probably leading indicators of that risk, saying, okay, where should I start looking next? Again, bottom line, these types of views allow us to make a more holistic approach for the compliance health of a market and derive insights on the summaries and trends.
Yeah, and a really important part of this journey is how you partner with other functions, because that too could be a rate limiter if you don't have not just the data and the systems, but you don't have the partners in technology or others along with you for the ride with that same ambition in mind. And I was wondering if you guys could take us through, some best practices or just some practices, some learnings from partnering with other teams and how you integrated your efforts with other existing processes.
Sure, I'm happy to take a stab, and HIMA, you can add on as necessary. I think hopefully it's been apparent throughout this discussion, but our partnership with HIMA's team is perhaps the most critical element of all of this, right? Because we bring the business questions, we're working with them as we go through the iterations of how we can unlock value from what we're doing. And certainly HIMA's team is bringing that analytics expertise to bring that to bear. I think what's equally critical, certainly Michael, and earlier in the discussion, we've alluded to bringing all of your IT friends along the journey, and there's definitely a lot of them, which is exceptionally critical. I would say the other thing that's been really important for us is that we make sure we can call it design thinking or what you will, that what we design is also something that is keeping the business and our compliance advisors to the business in mind. So they both find it user-friendly and intuitive and can get value out of it. So we've really started to work with them right from the beginning of this journey. So they're with us every step of the process. And I'd say that's also been pretty important. And certainly continuing to get external benchmarking is invaluable. And I'm a big proponent of tapping into peers and colleagues, as well as consulting firms like yours, Michael, to really get the latest and greatest in terms of the thinking. HIMA, anything to add?
Malini summarized that well. I mean, really, the way I would look at it as, how can the outcomes from these advanced analytics capabilities be integrated into your existing, right? So they beautifully complement and strengthen, what we have here. So it is in no way replacing, but it's truly, further strengthening our capabilities here.
Yeah, and that's a great segue into what we wanted to illustrate on this slide. Actually, Michael, if we could just spend, I think, a minute on the previous slide, because there are some key takeaways that I think are worth pointing out. As we've gone through this pilot, what's been really important is to say, how can we get value out of it in the near term, while thinking there might be some things that as we continue to iterate might be more of a long-term proposition, right? But to HIMA's point, how can we start to integrate it into even some of our existing processes to be even more targeted with our risk mitigation efforts, as well as add value to those that we're serving? So if I were to go through this clockwise, HIMA talked a little bit about how we could start to segment risk, get more visibility into what are some of those features that might be driving risks. So I think all of those are great as compliance professionals to see. Are there pockets of risk that are bubbling up, which could be an early signal to say, maybe this is where we need to deploy some additional training and communication. Maybe this is where some of our compliance advisors need to lean in a little bit more. So I think that's a tangible outcome. And if we move through this kind of clockwise to the next one with the compliance risk assessment, most of us are doing some version of compliance risk assessment, and a lot of times it tends to be qualitative and perception based. So as we get outputs like these risk scores, again, I think that can be another quantitative element to consider in our compliance risk assessment activities, which I think both nicely challenges as well as complements our qualitative perceptions of how well risks are being managed. So we kind of definitely see that as a nice use case. And I'll also highlight email and other unstructured monitoring data and live and transactional monitoring here, because there's always going to be certain kinds of activities that create compliance risk that don't lend themselves very well to like a rules-based dashboard like we had illustrated earlier, right? You can think about your call notes, your patient support programs, which are all pretty hot button topics now. So we do need to do these other kinds of pretty manually intensive monitoring still. So this could be a great way to really target those activities rather than, and I think we already do that to some extent, but I think this just really turbocharges that.
Yeah, Malini, on that point, I think the coolest thing, and the way I describe it, is there are qualitative ways to assess risk that you could input in a certain way to make it structured data that you could then triangulate with other structured data. So it's really generates a lot of opportunities for compliance professionals.
Exactly.
So with that, moving on, do we want to talk about how this intersects with like various enterprise risks?
Yes, and the other very exciting thing for us has been to also look at other pockets of data within the enterprise, which also have a lot of relevance if you think about compliance risks, right? Where we are from a product life cycle, how our employees feel about the culture and their ability to speak up. All of these are also really great indicators as it relates to compliance risk management. So what's been interesting and what we're exploring, we have started exploring and will continue to build on, is how do we then integrate the score we're getting from the pilot with the unsupervised algorithm that HIMA described with some of these other data points, so we could start to have a more unified view of compliance risk for a market, for example, right? So it's not that, hey, your compliance outliers are indicating this internal audit is that, and you basically have the biggest product going off patent, but really you could kind of bring that all together and say, this is the unified view of risk, and also provide insight into what some of those drivers might be to really effectively identify and manage those risks. I think this is a great way to kind of get to those leading indicators, like I said, right? As you kind of look at maybe there's a group whose performance is lagging. You have newly launched products. You also have lagging culture indicators. I think together that really highlights a group that probably needs some additional compliance focus. And it's a neat way to kind of start looking at potentially correlations among some of these data points. Is there correlations between a product lifecycle and investigations, for example, or a product lifecycle and some of our compliance outliers? Are we really seeing once training is delivered a favorable trend in some of these exceptions? So I think the ability to integrate what we're doing from an advanced analytics with some of these cross-functional data sets, it also has a lot of promise. Again, we haven't unleashed all of this value, but we are really hoping to and are definitely on the journey too.
Yep, and I think we're just about at time. So why don't we just throw on the slide some key lessons, and if you guys want to walk it through just quickly, so we just reinforce and punctuate some of those points that we covered today.
Absolutely, Michael. Quick recap. You want to start off with, setting your objectives for your future roadmap by prioritizing which use cases offer most value for you in the short term versus long term. You want to make sure you have good access to good quality data and also talent, right? Whether it's in-house or partner with service providers like ZS. And most importantly, I hope you've taken away that we don't have to be afraid to experiment and also fail in the beginning. And finally, it's not going to be a one size fits all. There are so many different options and really business involvement to determine which approach is best suited for solving the problem is going to be critical. And Malini, anything else that you want to add to the takeaways here?
Just one thing, we're not alone on this journey. Reach out to your friends, whether it's in other pharma companies or consultants and vendors with off-the-shelf solutions, because I think that's how we all move forward on this journey. And I'm personally happy to connect offline, as perhaps my colleagues are as well.
Yeah, absolutely. No, Malini, HIMA, thank you so much for sharing all these insights on your journey to help others and to also just make it practical for folks. So really enjoyed the session. And just if anyone was curious, right now my stress rate is very high. I'm not kidding. It's 80 or 81 out of 100, only because I don't know whether we went over time or not, because we had a little glitch earlier. So with that, I'll try to calm down. But thank you again, and thanks for those who participated and watched the presentation. We really look forward to everyone in the industry advancing risk management by using advanced analytics. So thank you.
Thank you. It's been a privilege.